Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Previously on Hidden Gems or Trash.
Curse those little maggots.
Yeah, that sucks, but who cares? No one is playing this game anyway.
How is that possible?
Your work is just beginning, Invictus Thrax. You have been chosen.
Very well.
Picking her up will slowly regenerate her health, which is very cute. That was sarcasm, by the way.
Enough.
Here we are with another episode of this ongoing series.
What?
If this is your first time watching, this is the series of videos where I find some obscure and forgotten RPGs and action adventures and see if they are worth playing today. Every now and then I stumble upon some real hidden gems, and most of these games are recommended by you. Check out the full playlist of Hidden Gems or Trash, because I could have already covered the game you suggest. So without further ado, here is the new episode of Hidden Gems or Trash. Number 5. Borderzone. Borderzone is an action RPG released in 2005 on PC. I was very curious about this game because it looked like it could be a fun little RPG. Well, I wish I stayed curious because Borderzone is hands down one of the most frustrating games I ever played.
How is that possible?
When you first boot up older games like this, you expect to experience some technical issues. Especially with such obscure games with no actual fan base that will try to iron out those bugs or performance issues. To my surprise, I had zero issues running the game on my PC, it just works. 1080p resolution works just fine, although some elements of the UI are not exactly shown properly. That's not a problem with the resolution though, the UI is just atrocious. I mean, it's functional and it's not that tedious to navigate, but it looks very bad. Not to mention that a lot of UI elements are straight up confusing, because they lack explanation. English is the second language of this game, so that was to be expected to an extent. But the UI is only a very small problem in the grand scheme of things. First of all, the game begins with a cutscene where the main character is just a baby. His parents got killed by some bad guys with bows and arrows, and fast forward to present time, you're all grown up and joining the army. Congratulations. There is a character creation menu, but you can't customize how a character looks. However, you get plenty of RPG options when you create your character. You can choose one of 3 character basic classes and invest points into various attributes. Speaking of which, the game is really weird when it comes to this. Why do you get 19 condition and capability points or 24 combat points? Who knows? What the hell is build, self-restraint and artifact stats? Who knows? Why are you asking so many questions, man? I thought you like RPG stats. Just play the game and enjoy, who cares? That's me talking to myself, by the way. I was actually excited to start exploring the map, especially because I didn't expect Borderzone to be an open world game. You get a very simple quest in the beginning, you're supposed to talk with the commander of the army and off you go. But I decided to explore the first area a little bit in order to figure out how things work. You can pick up a lot of items, do some side quests for gold and talk with different NPCs. It started off like a proper sandbox RPG, but it quickly turns into a loading screen simulator. No, but seriously, this is the biggest problem with the game, which almost made me quit after 1 hour of gameplay. Remember when Oblivion starts loading the open world in the middle of exploring the open world? Well, take that and multiply it by 20 and you get Borderzone. How about this example? You get to the entrance of another zone, right? You suffer through a very long loading screen, and if you decide to explore the zone on the right, you're immediately greeted with, you guessed it, another loading screen. To make things even worse, some enemies will be waiting for you at the entrance and immediately attack you. I installed the game on a very fast SSD, so I don't even want to know how it runs on a hard drive. Just imagine the poor bastard from 2005 trying to run this game on an average PC from that day and age. You don't have to do that because no one played this game anyway, except a YouTuber who's desperately trying to entertain you. Anyway, putting my misery aside, the gameplay in Borderzone is worse than you think. This game plays like a traditional CRPG, well, at least it tries to. I was really curious about the party system because you can tell from the very beginning that you're able to have followers. So I had something to look forward to, even though the basic mechanics of the gameplay were pretty bad. The click to move control scheme is very clunky, especially in closed areas like houses and dungeons. The camera has inverted controls by default because our buddy Dimitri, the lead developer of the game, probably prefers it that way. There is an option to make the camera automatic, and I thought it couldn't be worse than this, but I was wrong. I got used to the camera eventually, but the gameplay is a totally different story. When you get in combat, you have to repeatedly press the left mouse button to attack. Your character wobbles around like a moron, and your attacks get interrupted very often by enemy attacks. This is quite possibly related to the initiative stat, but still, it feels very bad in the beginning. You can't even see their health, by the way, because why you wanna do that? Fighting multiple opponents like this is a complete nightmare, especially if you didn't do some starting quests and get some better gear. Now, I can appreciate the lack of hand-holding, and when RPGs encourage you to improve your character a little bit before you venture into open world. But in order for that to feel good, the gameplay needs to be, you know, at least a bit more fun than getting your ballsack stuck in a bike chain. When I realized I can't even kill a couple of wolves while exploring the second area of the map, I went back and did almost everything I could in the first city. I bought a lot of potions, which was a big mistake actually. The healing in this game doesn't make any sense because the food and potions will regenerate your health slower than those load screens I mentioned before. But check this out, you can rest and regenerate your health instantly, assuming you're not surrounded by enemies. For the majority of my time with the game, I thought it doesn't have any sound effects in combat. Then I realized they exist, but they're very quiet, and they got overpowered by the soundtrack. And tweaking the sound settings won't help that much. The excitement I had for the full party of characters quickly dissolved because I didn't play enough to get to that part. This game broke me, man. I was still kinda curious, so I looked for some gameplay videos. I could barely find anything, but I saw when this guy had some mages in his party and they just attack your enemies, you can't control them. So there you go, fucking Borderzone. Listen, if you even try to play this game nowadays, just be sure to leave a comment, so I can ban you in the chat. On the bright side, you can use my GOG link for it, so I can get some money. I never said it's your bright side. No, but seriously, don't buy this garbage. Number 4. Beowulf. Beowulf is a hack and slash game released in 2007 on Xbox 360, PC, PlayStation 3 and PSP. I'm pretty sure that Ubisoft wants you to forget this game ever existed.
Wow, actions speak louder than words, hero.
Yeah, it was developed and published by Ubisoft, and it was actually released a few days before the movie Beowulf. You can't find this game in any modern online gaming store like Steam or GOG, so if you're curious to try it out, well, get your pirate hat ready. Now, everyone knows that movie games are usually horrible.
What is this to me?
Beowulf is not the worst movie game out there, but that's not saying much. However, if you're a fan of the movie, you could potentially enjoy this game quite a bit, despite the underwhelming gameplay, which is plagued by quick time events. Yeah, 2007 action game that has QTEs, imagine that.
Still not sure what you're doing here, eh, King of the Danes?
Up to this point, I covered a bunch of similar games in these videos, and it truly seems like the majority of AAA developers, and even some smaller studios back then, were convinced that QTE is a revolutionary feature. Then again, I hated this feature way more in all other similar games, which I covered previously in this series. We'll get to that very soon, but let's start from the beginning. If you're not familiar with Beowulf, it's one of the oldest surviving poems in the English language. The movie from 2007 had a mixed reception. It seemed like people either absolutely love it or hate it. It was not a live action movie, even though it could easily trick you back in the day, which goes to say that the animation was pretty damn good, especially for a 2007 movie. The characters in the game are voice acted by the same actors from the movie, which is something you will appreciate if you're a fan.
The son deserves his reward. I'll never let it go. I'll die with this cup of yours at my side.
The presentation of the game still holds up for the most part. I ran the game in 4K with zero technical issues, so if you wanna try this game out today, that's some good news for you. It's not so hard to see that the game had a very decent budget. It might even be a AAA budget, although I'm not sure. The visual still holds up, even though some locations feel very bland and uninspired, but the graphical fidelity is very decent for a 2007 game. My problem with the visuals in the game are some very bland environments that you're going to explore. Well, maybe explore is not the best word to use, since the game is very linear. Beowulf has some very nice looking levels every now and then, but the majority of them look very generic. Character models still look very decent, again for a 2007 game, and the same can be said about most animations. The story follows the mythical Viking warrior called Beowulf. Together with his army of Danes, he's going on a mission to kill the monster called Grendel that's been terrorizing the Danes and to kill Hrothgar. The game starts at the beach, where we're going through a tutorial that drags on for about 30 minutes. Beowulf doesn't leave good first impressions, but as you keep playing, it does get a bit better. Not drastically better though, but still. I played the game with my PS5 controller, and I had no major issues with the controls in general. The game can feel a bit stiff while performing some actions like climbing, but it's not a big deal. Unfortunately, the game heavily relies on QTE gimmicks, in and out of combat, which just feels stupid and boring. For example, one of the essential mechanics that you're going to use all the time is this Guitar Hero-like minigame. You see, Beowulf is either the greatest hype man ever, or he's the one being hyped up by his army of Danes.
Here we go! Destiny calls! Yeah!
While that aspect of his character was great in the movie, it doesn't really translate well into game mechanics. You have to keep hyping up your army to do very simple actions like moving rocks out of the way, singing songs before the battle, or even steering the damn boat. Yeah, you can't press a simple command to go left, you have to sing a damn song. What's even worse, this can be interrupted by enemies on some levels, it's pretty annoying. Speaking of your army, you get a couple of more mechanics related to them. You can buff them up, which doesn't seem to do that much, but it looks cool, or making them follow you, and again, that's not very useful. However, if all of your Danes fall in a battle, you lose the game. This happened once or twice, so it's not a big deal. What is a big deal is the underwhelming action combat, which is hyper-focused on fancy finishing animations with, you guessed it, bunch of QTEs. While all of these moves are brutal and fun to experience for the first 10 times, they quickly get repetitive and boring to look at, because you're doing the same thing over and over again. The QTEs are not that aggressive and unapologetic like in some similar games I recently covered, but that doesn't make them more fun. What pisses me off is the actual combat, which had the potential to be very good. You get a simple combo system with your melee weapons that you can pick up on specific places on the map, or even steal from enemies if you wish. The animations and sound effects are very decent, but there is no rhyme or reason behind the health system. You can see the health of enemies, except in boss fights, which are pretty rare, but even then it doesn't work like you would expect. You have a health bar, but it makes even less sense. Your health will be very low most of the time, and it's never clear enough when you can take the final blow and die. There's this mechanic called Cardinal Fury, which is like a berserk mode that drains your health almost completely, but it makes you stronger. Stronger in a way that allows you to skip the regular fighting and just abuse the finishing moves we talked about before. It's hilarious how badly this mechanic is designed, because it essentially allows you to skip the regular fighting and go straight to the finishing move. Even though your health in this mode is very low, it doesn't matter because it's very hard to die, even on so-called hard difficulty. But then again, if you let it run for too long, you can't die just because of that. It's one of the weirdest health systems I ever experienced, but then again, I wasn't that surprised. It reminds me a bit of Crusade, which is another game from a similar time period, which I covered in the series.
They rain arrows on us like a pissing cow!
Just a mindless button mash without any actual weapon stats that matter, like, you know, damage. The game starts bombarding you with different objectives on each level. Most of those objectives are fine, if you ignore the fact that you're going to repeat the same thing over and over again, even on the same level. I did fail a couple of times when I had to save you guys from a bunch of ogres. No, but seriously, a lot of objectives involve you saving virgins from ogres or resisting the temptations of these crazy bitches. The game is low-key entertaining in those situations, but for all the wrong reasons. There is some light puzzle solving and platforming to break the monotony here and there, and that basically sums it up. It took me around 7 hours to complete the game, and I absolutely don't recommend trying it out, unless you're a huge fan of the movie. Like I said, it's a shame because it had the potential to be a great hack and slash game. It definitely had the budget for it.
I'll crush your bones!
Number 3. Dawn of Magic 2. Dawn of Magic 2 is an isometric action RPG released in 2009 on PC. In North America, this game was called Times of Shadows for some reason. First of all, I desperately tried to make the first game work on my PC because people who played both games claim that the first game is way superior. As far as I could tell, they look and play very similar, but the first game has more content and chapters, although don't quote me on that. Dawn of Magic 1 is not available on any online store, you can't buy it, and like I said, even if you find the copy online, it's very hard to get it working. On the other side, Dawn of Magic 2 can be bought on GOG or Steam, so it's way more convenient and it works out of the box on modern PCs. At least it did for me, but I saw that some people have problems with the game on Steam and GOG, as well as in some YouTube comments. Luckily, I was able to run it in 4K without any issues whatsoever. No bugs, frame drops or any technical issues, so that's some good news, I guess. Anyway, the premise of this game is very good. The gameplay is entirely based around magic, you get shit ton of options to build your mage character. There are more than 100 spells within 12 different schools of magic. You literally can play the game as a warrior or a rogue, like I said, it's all about magic. Now, I usually tend to play RPGs as a warrior, but I also enjoy magic-based gameplay and I played a bunch of games with similar philosophy like Dawn of Magic. However, I expected a lot more from this game. I know I immediately started talking about the gameplay because the story is pretty bad, but here's the main gist of it. There are monsters in this world and your job is to kill them all with magic. Do you follow?
What?
No, but seriously, you won't be playing this game for the story, trust me.
What's new in the world, George?
What's new? You see, Professor, as you understand, I am not a young man anymore.
You can start the game with 4 different characters and you don't have any character customization options. None of these characters look that appealing to me, but I went with the Professor because it makes the most sense, in a way. You know, you're the Professor of Magic at the University of Magic.
That concludes our lesson for today.
Other playable characters look like random people from the street. It's really weird, but charming in a way. The biggest difference is the starting point on the map, but as far as I'm aware, everything else is pretty much the same. I also played a little bit with the Priest when I was done with the Professor. They get slightly different stats and that's pretty much it. Surprisingly, all dialogue lines are voice acted, and as you would expect, it's not very good.
Will you help? I'll repay you, I swear.
Fine, I will help. But remember, you owe me one. Close your eyes.
Enough, I'm not here for sex.
The game likes to rotate your camera after every single dialogue line, which is a bit annoying, but like I said, I just skip through the most of the dialogue. That's because it's literally go there, kill this monster or protect these NPCs. In my defense, there are only a handful of ARPGs where I cared about the story. Anyway, some of the side quests are really frustrating, especially when you need to babysit some NPCs. The thing is, doing side quests and grinding is pretty much essential in this game in order to progress. If you try to rush the main quest, you'll get obliterated by enemies. You start off with more than a few spells, which is a bit confusing, but it's also fun to try them all out in combat. However, I would always prefer a more straightforward progression where you start the game with a single spell and you gradually unlock everything. Although this design decision starts to make more sense in Dawn of Magic because most of these spells from different elements are pretty much the same with different visuals. But even so, there are enough unique spells to learn, so that's not a huge issue. You have a hotbar where you can put spells of your choice, and when you select the spell, you cast it by pressing the right mouse button. Besides that, you can add another effect on top of that basic spell simply by dragging and dropping it on this hotbar in the left corner of the screen. Pretty simple and effective, and I have to say that I really like the UI design. Not all of the UI aspects, but the majority of them look really nice and clean. The visual style of the UI is pretty damn good as well. I mean, look at these loading screens, really fun to look at. The controls on the other side are not amazing. They're not bad though, but the control scheme lacks some basic options that you would expect in an isometric action RPG. For example, you can't hold the button to remain stationary and cast the spell like in many ARPGs. This means that you always have to target the enemy with your mouse, which can be really tedious sometimes, because if you miss, your character moves to that direction. After all, this game came out in 2009, and even ARPGs from 2006 had this option. Most enemies in this game are pretty damn fast, which is a good thing for the gameplay in general, but like I said, this can be frustrating because you don't feel like you have complete control of your character. Moving around is totally fine, but casting spells while moving around feels more clunky than it should be. The balancing of the game seems way off in the beginning hours of gameplay. You can either kill the enemy really easy, or you suddenly get swarmed from every direction. Now, different elements will deal different amounts of damage to some enemies, and it's up to you to experiment a little bit. But it doesn't make a lot of sense in some cases. For example, these fire termites are really weak to fire, which is stupid. On the other side, the variety of enemies in the game is pretty good. I mean, just look at this, you get attacked by 5 different enemy types at once. It's not just about the cosmetic side of things, most of these enemy types fight in a unique way. That's quite impressive, I would say, because a lot of similar games are struggling with enemy variety. That would actually be really cool, but like I said, the control scheme is not the best, which makes fighting some of these enemies more frustrating than it should be. On the bright side, there are plenty of spells to try out, and I personally went for blood and fire magic, although I didn't get far in the game. What's really cool about different schools of magic, you'll start seeing some visual changes on your character. I started growing horns for all of my body parts, and I seen some cool effects like wings if you decide to dump points into air magic. Lastly, another problem that I found with the game is the lack of rewards. The itemization system in this game is a complete joke. One of the biggest reasons why I play games like this is that sweet loot system that makes your character look and feel stronger and stronger. Dawn of Magic 2 is completely deprived of such systems, unfortunately. I don't know if I would recommend this game or not.
Close your eyes.
To put it like this, if you're desperately searching for an RPG that focuses a lot on magic, you might find it enjoyable. And if you think the problems I mentioned are not a big deal, you could have some fun. Number 2. Requital. Requital is an action RPG released in 2006 on PC. This has to be one of the most obscure RPGs that I ever covered in these videos. So naturally, you can't buy this game nowadays unless you can find a CD by some miracle. There are no records on Metacritic, and the info about the game in general is very scarce. That's a shame because this is a pretty enjoyable RPG. It has its flaws obviously, and it starts off really slow, but it gets way more interesting as you progress. It's also not a very long RPG, you'll need around 10 hours to complete it. Unfortunately, there are no options for modern resolutions like Full HD or 4K, and I just had to use this 4:3 resolution with black bars. This game also has some frame drops here and there, probably because it has a limited RAM usage and the number of CPU cores. Putting that aside, the story follows the character called Wolfhound, who is trying to avenge himself on those who destroyed his clan, murdered his parents and enslaved him as a young boy. It's essentially a revenge storyline, but to be honest, I didn't pay that much attention to it. I played this game like a mindless Diablo-like RPG, but I regret that decision now. In my defense, Requital doesn't leave very good first impressions, so I thought I'm probably going to quit after only a couple of hours. Well, I'm glad I didn't, because this little RPG offers an enjoyable experience. The setting of this game is grounded in reality, so there are no magic or monsters, except a couple of them. That's also one of the game's weaknesses if you ask me, especially because the enemies you're going to fight lack the variety. On the other side, I'm a fan of a more realistic settings in RPGs and light fantasy elements. I just think it doesn't work that well in this game, from the gameplay perspective at least. Since there is no magic at all, you only get to play as a ranged or a melee character, or mix them together. The voice acting in this game is quite possibly one of the worst, if not the worst I ever experienced. I would prefer no voice acting at all instead of this.
What do you want? Silently take Sumka. We'll meet at the agreed place. Greel, don't let me down. You are welcome, O son of a good mother.
Luckily, the voice lines are few and far between, but seriously, some of these voice lines are freaking hilarious. The game manages to create a very nice atmosphere, and I knew it feels a bit familiar. It reminded me a little bit about Hard to Be a God, which is another game that I covered in this series. It turns out that's not a coincidence, because these games had the same publisher. Anyway, graphically the game still looks okay, but noticeably outdated, obviously. The graphical fidelity was definitely not the best that 2006 had to offer, but it's also not the worst. The environments are still looking decent, and the biggest city in the game is still impressive, in a way. Although it's a little bit disappointing that the majority of indoor areas are not accessible at all. Literally, the whole game is revolved around outdoor areas, which is not bad per se, but you might get an impression that you can enter some buildings. This also means that there is no dungeon crawling, like, at all. The map is somewhat open, but very restrictive when it comes to exploration. This game doesn't bore you with side quests, even though you will pick up some of them while talking to NPCs. But it's mostly focused on the main quest, and that's the main reason why the game is not so long. As for the gameplay, it starts off really simple, but it actually has a decent amount of depth, especially if you consider the lack of any magic spells or magic gameplay in general. The controls are not that smooth though, which might be the biggest issue with the gameplay. You use click to move, and you can turn the camera by holding the right mouse button or use the arrow keys. Using the right mouse button for camera controls feels janky as all hell, it's much smoother with the arrow keys. It should be the other way around, because it feels more natural to rotate the camera with the mouse in these kinds of games, at least for me. You can zoom out a lot in this game, and while you move the character, the camera also moves, which makes the gameplay more janky than it should be. That's not a huge issue though, because the combat is not very fast. You have more than enough time to issue commands to your character, even though sometimes he will just ignore your input. Yeah, it's not a very responsive gameplay, but it's not horrible. Clicking on enemies will trigger the auto attack, and as you level up, you unlock more active and passive abilities. The game has a classic RPG stat system with some dose of confusion, like in most Russian RPGs that I played. It's usually the issue with the English translation, but to a lesser extent in this particular case. The game has an enjoyable improve on use system for ranged and melee attacks. The more you use melee or ranged weapons, the more your skill improves, and you get bonus points that you can use to unlock new abilities. These abilities, as well as items, require you to have a certain level and stats. There are some cool abilities to unlock for both playstyles, and you can mix them up, which is probably the best way to play the game. There is a hotbar for switching weapons and using consumables. On top of that, there is a stamina system as well, which I ignored in the first couple of hours. However, it's quite important for you and the enemies. When the stamina drops by using abilities or taking hits, you're prone to getting knocked down, which is almost like a death sentence. Enemies can finish you up fast if this happens, but the same goes for them as well. This also seems to depend on the level of enemies. Requital doesn't have level scaling, all enemies have fixed levels, which means that you can't just rush through the main quest and kill everyone. It's pretty much required to explore the map a little bit and kill enemies of your level. But I wouldn't call this grinding, because it doesn't take too long. You just kill enemies as you go, pretty much. Even when you're close to enemies level, they can still be pretty challenging to kill. There is a certain dose of RNG in fights as well. The AI is really exploitable and brain dead sometimes, especially if you try to kite them or just move a little bit instead of standing on the same spot. Requital can also have some annoying difficulty spikes, but for the most part, I did enjoy the challenge. The game doesn't hold your hand at all. Getting a better weapon or a piece of armor is immediately reflected in the combat, which makes the progression feel very nice. But don't expect a huge variety of weapons like in Diablo-like RPGs. There is a meditation button that you have to use, which slowly regenerates your health. Overall, this game really surprised me. I had a lot of fun with it, and I'm glad I didn't quit. It's hard to recommend it though, because even if you manage to find the download for it and install it, you might have some problems getting it to run. If you're really curious and you love older RPGs like Requital, you should give it a try. Number 1. Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade. Knights of the Temple Infernal Crusade is an action-adventure released in 2004 for PC, Xbox, GameCube and PlayStation 2. A lot of people recommended this game in the comments, and after playing and completing the game, I can definitely see why. Knights of the Temple is an action-packed game with a very satisfying combat system. You play as a Templar called Paul, who is trying to stop an evil bishop and interrupt the unholy circle. In order to do that, he needs to save Adele, the ghost girl that's going to appear often in cutscenes. Speaking of which, the game has quite a few cutscenes on almost all levels. The story is very simple and kinda generic, but it's not bad. It's more than enough for this type of a game that's focusing a lot more on the action itself. The game aged okay in general, and you shouldn't have any problems to run it nowadays. I ran it in 4K without any issues, crashes or bugs. Yeah, remember when games just worked out of the box? Fun times. All of my footage of the game is much darker for some reason, so I had to increase the brightness and contrast to make it more watchable. I really don't know why, so I'm sorry for that. This is a 2004 game, so you should expect some outdated visuals, of course. However, I certainly seen and played a lot worse than this. Putting the graphical fidelity aside, the levels in the game look really basic and generic, with very little detail. On the other side, the level design is exactly what you would expect from a 2004 game, in the best way possible. There are 29 different levels, and the majority of them require you to kill a bunch of enemies, find the keys to open some doors and do some simple puzzles. This kind of level design was very prominent back in the day in many different genres of games, not just the action adventures. In between those side activities, you're going to fight a bunch of enemies. This game didn't grip me right from the start, to be honest. The combat seemed very simple and kinda annoying. But that's because the game throws at you the most annoying enemy type in the beginning. These crazy monks are a pain in the ass to fight, although their animations are quite amusing to watch. Controlling your character is pretty responsive, except in some specific moments when it feels a bit clunky. That's mostly because the game doesn't allow you to cancel your animations, but this is also one part of the game's difficulty. I made a crucial mistake because I started the game on the hardest difficulty. It's not because the game is very hard, but because you don't get to save the game at certain points on the level. So if you die, you have to repeat the whole level from the start, which can be very frustrating. There is also a big difficulty spike, which goes down drastically after you learn the healing spell. Before that, the only way to heal is by finding the potions on dead enemies or by breaking boxes. The healing spell makes the game way easier, but it still doesn't lack the challenge in general. You get a simple combo in the beginning of the game, and as you progress through the levels you will unlock more combat moves. These involve the mentioned combos, special strong attacks and divine powers. I used a very simple combo from the beginning to the very end. What's more important is the distance and positioning, because missing your attacks is very easy if you don't close the gap between you and the enemy. The game incentivizes an aggressive playstyle, especially against regular enemies. Enemies will be equally aggressive, and they're more than happy to do the same thing to you if you let them. Shortly after the beginning, you'll encounter enemies that require you to use your stronger combat moves. Mostly to break their block, so you can do some damage, but later in the game you can unlock a very strong offensive move as well. Even so, breaking the block of the enemy is hands down the most important ability in the game. Another reason why I wouldn't recommend the highest difficulty is the length of each and every fight in the game. Even against the most basic enemies, these fights can go on and on. It can feel like a drag until you unlock those stronger moves I mentioned before, but even then you'll have some enemies that take forever to kill. Speaking of which, there are only a handful of enemy types in the entire game, which is definitely the biggest problem with the gameplay. The game tries to introduce some new enemy types, but they only have a new attack or a new skin on top of them. This can make the combat feel very repetitive, especially on the hardest difficulty. Luckily, the combat in general can be really fun, because it has a decent amount of weight, good animations and solid progression. Like I said, when you unlock the healing spell, the game becomes a lot easier, but in a good way. You have two different resource bars, one is for special combat moves and the other is for spells. Apart from healing, you'll get a buff spell, magic missiles and a shockwave. I found the healing spell most useful, so I tried to save my resource and just use that when needed. For some reason, performing combos never felt that smooth to me. So I found the most success with the simple combination of regular and strong attack. You can't just mash the attack button and win, because enemies will try to interrupt you and use the same abilities that you have. You will find different weapons as you progress through these levels. There are 4 weapon slots, 3 for melee weapons and 1 for bow and arrow. I failed to see any difference between the melee weapons. The damage always seemed identical, no matter which weapon I use, it's mostly cosmetic. Maybe I'm wrong and there is a slight difference, but it certainly didn't seem so. You can't even see the damage on weapons in the menu. Same goes for the armor. You will automatically change the armor as you progress through the levels. And if you're wondering about the boss fights, well, I'll have to disappoint you here. Those enemies are more like elite NPCs that the game will start using on regular basis after you defeat them. The boss fight at the end is also like whatever. Putting that aside, I think this game is well worth playing because it still manages to offer a unique experience. Despite the issues I mentioned, the gameplay is really enjoyable in general. Just make sure to play on the normal difficulty. Which game from this list looks the most interesting to you and why? Leave a comment down below.
Close your eyes.
I'll have GOG links for some of these games, and if you want to buy them, you can support the channel by using my links. Speaking of supporting the channel, I just launched my personal store where you can buy some interesting t-shirts and hoodies. Check out some cool designs in the theme of the channel, like this RPG Zone hoodie or Nameless Hero t-shirt. But you'll find a lot more if you follow the link in the description. I think that's a great way to get something back for supporting the channel. And of course, you can always become a Patreon or a YouTube member and get your name on the end credits of my videos. Many thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.